Okay, I see most folks are in place. I want to welcome you. Thank you for joining us for the next session of the CAHC. I'm Chelsea Ross, and Carlene Sharmalis is here with me from the partnership today supporting this session. As you know, our theme this year is Here for Housing. It's our opportunity to convene, collaborate, and drive meaningful change to improve and expand housing affordability, creation, choice, and stability across our state. You can join in on the conversation at hashtag CAHC 2024 across social. This session is entitled Philanthropy and Action, Bridging Gaps to Drive Housing Affordability and Social Justice in Connecticut. Before we turn it over to our presenters for this session, we'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority, our visionary sponsor, Wells Fargo, our champion sponsors, Liberty Bank, the Connecticut Department of Housing, CohnReznick, Trinity Financial, J.D. Amelia Associates, and Robinson & Cole. And thank you to our foundation sponsors. All of our sponsors help us make the conference happen each year and keep it free of charge for everyone to attend. So big thank you to all of our sponsors. Last but not least, a big thank you to our featured investor sponsor for this session, Point 32 Health Foundation. A few quick housekeeping items before we get started. We are recording this breakout session. We will make all recordings from the conference available as soon as possible. Please do us a favor and remain on mute unless a speaker asks you to unmute. If you have a tech issue, you can select the chat icon in the Zoom control panel and send it in chat to either myself or Carlene, and we'll do our best to assist you. And your speakers today will let you know how they would like you to submit questions to them. Post-session, you can complete a quick session feedback survey by clicking on the megaphone icon in the lobby. We really appreciate your feedback. With that, I will now turn it over to Erica Frank to get us started.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Chelsea, for hosting us today. And so I'm very pleased to introduce this session, which is focused on the most effective roles for private philanthropy in the housing sector. My name's Erica Frank, and I'm the president of the Farmington Bank Community Foundation. I'm honored to be joined by several of my colleagues who will make up today's panel. So we've got Becca Allen, who's Senior Program Officer at the Melville Charitable Trust, John Cabral, Director at the Connecticut Project, Julian Pierce, Director of Economic Opportunity at Fairfield County Community Foundation, and Kate Piotrowski, Senior Community Impact Officer at the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving. And we are going to have a sort of an informal discussion amongst ourselves. If you have questions, feel free to throw them in the chat, but we'll have time at the end for questions as well. And so just to set the stage a little bit for our discussion, we all know Connecticut has a pretty expansive philanthropic landscape. Many the types of foundations that exist are here today. I mean, corporate, family, private philanthropy, community foundations. And generally, it's true both locally and nationally that health, education, the arts make up the majority of philanthropic spending. However, as housing has become a higher priority community issue throughout our state, we've seen more funder interest in the housing sector. So given this interest, the Connecticut Council for Philanthropy started convening funders in 2020, thanks to Becca for instigating those convenings, to start learning more about housing issues together. So we've been bringing funders together for a few years now, and last year we even did a statewide survey of funders on their housing funding. So a few of the things that we learned, close to a third of the funders surveyed were looking to increase their grant making in the housing space, which is pretty significant. But most of them do not actually have staff with specific content expertise in the field. There's a lot of interest in shared learning and collaboration. There's also a keen understanding among funders that, especially in housing, just funding direct service is not always the most effective use of our limited dollars. So funders indicated that they're interested in increasing their grant making in areas where they think they can make systemic change. So policy and advocacy, organizing, resident power building, research and evaluation, which makes a lot of sense. Philanthropy doesn't have the dollars to fund direct service or actually fund the development of housing at a scale that would be meaningful, that's a much better role for government resources. But philanthropy does have a unique and important role that actually interplays well with public funding. Private dollars bring flexibility, risk tolerance, and the ability to look at issues with a very long time horizon, all of which are very important to funding innovation, building collaboration, capacity, et cetera. So today, we're really going to highlight some of the ways that philanthropic leaders throughout the state are investing in the housing space and the way they think about the unique role that philanthropy plays in the housing sector. So I'm going to start off our panel, and I'm going to start with you, Julian. As we saw in our survey of Connecticut funders, more foundations are coming to the policy and advocacy space as a way to make bigger impact on housing issues. So I wondered, if you could talk a little bit about your foundation's journey to becoming a policy funder and any advice you have for other funders hoping to get into this space.
Sure. Thank you for that introduction, Erica. And that's a very, very, I'd say, intriguing question that's going to require, as a person in philanthropy, to do some soul searching and thinking beyond myself and more about the institution's journey. But for the better part of a decade and eventually sunsetting in 2017, Fairfield County's Community Foundation had what we call the Funders Collaborative for Affordable Housing, which I would call our entry point into really, our trajectory into the policy funding space around housing. We learned a lot over the course of that decade. If you invest general operating support into nonprofits, especially nonprofit housing developers and property managers and folks that do things like housing counseling services, they succeed. They are able to be more flexible. They're able to fund things like their back office. They're able to serve more clients. They're able to build more. They're able to manage more. They're able to, expand their portfolios. What we also learned was that the lack of housing is rigid. The lack of housing development is pervasive. Housing development has been slow, and our meager investment into those organizations' capacity didn't necessarily inject the fuel that we thought in terms of having our housing availability and stock expand in the way that it needed to for us, for Fairfield County. So over those years and to date, we've engaged with the nonprofit sector through data aggregation, through listening. We, of course, have had a lot of internal exploration and engagement with our board and key stakeholders that are not necessarily in the nonprofit sector, folks like donors, to really understand why these systems were so rigid and why we weren't able to see the impact, broad stroke, that we had hoped to with this decades-long investment, right? We still have an affordable housing shortage, and it's worse now than it was over a decade ago when we launched the collaborative fund. So what we learned and heard time and time again was it's not necessarily about these piecemeal investments. It's not even necessarily about long-term, predictable general operating support types of investment, but it's about things like policy and advocacy and leveraging our voice as a regional institution to really double down on the issue areas that our grantee and nonprofit community care about most, right? It's a little bit about trial and error. So on the side of, any advice I'd give to other funders, it's to understand your own appetite for risk and how much risk aversion is at play in your own operations, right? We know that across funding entities, across the philanthropic sector, we're not all ready to do things like write letters of support or sign on to a bill or help craft certain policies, right? But we may be able to support organizations that are in the work, right? We may be able to have arm's length relationships. We're all going to start from our own place, right? It's also important to understand your mission, vision, and values. For us, we care about systems change for racial equity. So for housing, we know that you can't get around policy, especially when you start talking about the equitable distribution of resources when it comes to housing development for folks that are low to moderate income. So are you married to your mission, something like system change for racial equity, or are you just courting it, right? Are you just beginning? Are you still trying to figure out where you are on that journey? And policy isn't necessarily where you are yet. Wherever you start, wherever you are, I would recommend that you come from a place of humility, right? We have a lot of strong expertise on the ground, especially when it comes to advocates, especially when it comes to advocates for housing and housing affordability. So trust their expertise. It's going to help you more than it hurts you. They're going to be able to equip you with data. They're going to be able to help you with storytelling to help make that internal case for that to be the next step in your journey. Um, it's not easy. It continues to be difficult work. And it was, increasingly difficult when we were trying to get folks like boards and donors on board with this point of direction for the foundation. So equip yourself with data, right? It's not always the best route to just try to appeal to folks, better angels, right? That, oh, housing is important because people can't afford to live here. But there are really concrete economic cases for why everyone in Connecticut and for us for Fairfield County will thrive and do better if we make this investment into the policy and advocacy component of this work. That's it for now, Eric.
That's great, Julian. And I love how you talk about there's multiple entry points to getting into the policy advocacy space. If you or your board are not quite comfortable necessarily using your own voice, even grant making to organizations that are doing policy work can be a good entree. And so really appreciate that thinking. And related to the policy and advocacy space, Becca, I want to talk a little bit about sort of the ground level, power building and organizing, and the fact that funders are realizing that these are also key tactics to making social change, and really being married to your mission, to borrow a term from Julian. And I think funders are also recognizing that we too need to organize, and together our work can be more powerful. Could you share a little bit more about the work of your foundation and others in this space?
Yes. I am thrilled to be joined with such talented colleagues. This just makes my heart sing. The Trust is a funder that funds solutions to end homelessness and housing instability for folks that are disproportionately impacted, which are Black, Indigenous, and Latinx folks in community. We are a national funder, and we fund in Connecticut. We have about 9 million that goes out the door each year. We have always, since 1990, been a funder that funds policy and advocacy. It's systems change, it's long haul work, it is humility, what Julian was talking about. But over 10 years ago, we started funding organizations that were either beginning to or build people with lived expertise, incorporating them into their organizations at leadership tables, driving change, finding solutions. And so for 10 years plus, that's where we have put our work. More recently, we added to our toolbox of policy and advocacy and created another strategy, which is building and shifting power. So in addition to supporting organizations incorporating people with lived expertise, we made our first grant to community organizing about 5 years ago in Connecticut. And those two kind of approaches to building and shifting power complement each other and are often intertwined. We recognize that the reason why we wanted to invest in organizing is it's people power, it's movement building. It's another way to complement the work of policy and advocacy. And the truth is, policy and advocacy and organizers can work in concert with each other. They can be aligned with each other. And the other thing is, they may not be, that their approaches and their styles and what they're asking for may not be aligned. And that's actually okay with the Trust. We want to be able to pull as many levers and support as much thinking, because this housing crisis and this homelessness crisis is a tough nut. So a bunch of different approaches, including organizing, is really helpful. We as funders obviously invest directly into systems change. We also recognize that when we join as a funder collaborative around things, that we kind of have more monies going into the field and more money and and we have more influence. There are 2 funder collaboratives in Connecticut that are focused on organizing. One is, it's called Supporting Organizing Work, and that is for foundations that are already investing in organizing directly, and they invest in which is a member driven affinity group. So you need to pay, kind of a pay to play model. And the funds that go to SO go directly towards staffing, support staffing, but also directly towards the fiscal sponsors and building up the infrastructure for organizers in Connecticut. As the trust, we may not have been able to give to that kind of building up fiscal sponsors directly, but because we are part of a funder collaborative, that we are able to expand kind of how we do the work and where the money goes. So again, so is building up infrastructure, which is fiscal sponsors. It's also giving flex dollars so that organizers can have immediate access to whatever they need. So it's also, and so is allowing all these foundations who are investing in organizing locally to collaborate, learn from each other, talk about what's needed, which is also the art and beauty of a funder collaborative. The second funder collaborative is part of the Housing Affinity Group, and the Housing Affinity Group started in 2021, and anybody who's funding in or not funding in, just loves talking about housing and homelessness, can join us monthly. About a year and a half ago, we really started wanting to take kind of our learning series into action and really figure out something that we wanted to do that would impact Connecticut and would be focusing on systems change. So we developed a request for proposal that was launched last summer that was called the Building a Suburban and Rural Housing Movement. And we went through a competitive process and have selected someone, people will hear about it soon. And what the suburban and rural housing movement's all about is we are so fortunate in Connecticut to have really talented policy and advocacy providers that are working, again, across systems at a statewide level. When we did a lot of talking to folks, what we found out that we were missing is what our neighbors are thinking in our suburban and rural communities about housing and how housing could actually benefit their own communities. So there are 13 funders that have co-invested to slowly, thoughtfully build upon what's already there, a housing movement with our rural and suburban neighbors on ultimately increasing a wide variety of housing options, but most importantly, affordable housing across Connecticut.
That is such exciting news, Becca. I mean, I think anyone that's worked in Connecticut in any field, whether it's housing or workforce or education, anywhere, you understand how fractured and parochial we are. And frankly, we've talked about this as funders, how we contribute to that, right? There's a lot of funders, especially in Connecticut, have a specific geographic focus. We haven't always worked together in a sort of comprehensive statewide way to do the things that none of us can do alone, right? The infrastructure that you were talking about. So that's really exciting. Thank you for sharing. I want to move a little bit afield to John. Your prior role was at a quasi-state entity, so both the power and limitations of state funding. Now you're at the Connecticut Project, so you're on the philanthropic side, and you're using private dollars to fund innovative approaches in the field to enhance the sector. Could you talk a little bit about your funding strategy at the Connecticut Project and maybe a little bit about how your work has changed as you moved from the public sector to philanthropy?
Sure, yeah. Great. So first I want to thank the partnership for organizing this. This is an awesome event. Honored to be part of this group with such esteemed colleagues and talking about the work. So I have been very fortunate to have had this interesting career that started almost 20 years ago, working at a commercial bank, doing Community Investment Act work, then working for the state of Connecticut at CHFA in public service for about 11 years, and now about a year, almost 2 years in philanthropy. And it's interesting to see, even during my time at the state, how things sort of changed with time and how the state viewed sort of its investment. And what's interesting to me is that what was amazing when working with state service was that you can bring significant resources to the work and really do some transformative systems change when you have sort of sort of your winds in your sail. But the reality is, when working in being part of state services, there are often shifts in sort of political appetite, and there's a change in risk tolerance. And so in my 11 years working at the state, I did see that, we did a lot of innovative projects, but with time and sort of the political environment, especially nowadays, it's really hard for government to be as innovative as it once was in the past, especially in the housing front. DOH here at the state of Connecticut is very innovative, does a lot of great work. But it is limited to what it can do, and this is the beauty of philanthropy. Philanthropy cannot replace government funding. We don't have the resources to do the stuff the state can do or the federal government can do. But what we can do is we can use different levers to sort of collaborate and align the work to help move affordable housing forward. So in my time at the Connecticut Project, we have seriously looked at how we can bring sort of our tools to unlock affordable housing. So to bring advocates around the table, to align our work together, to have a strong voice, to amplify the voices of folks who are experiencing the housing crisis, much like what Becca said. I mean, it's really important. Something that is I think going to be a game changer here in the state, and I'm looking forward to seeing the work that we do as a group going forward. To inform the work, to do research and figure out how we can do things better to really make systems change happen. I think this comes as no surprise, but there are many communities that are very wary of government and state research. And so I hope philanthropy can help those communities understand what are the needs and be a trusted partner. And not that I don't think the state is a trusted partner, but that's the reality in certain communities. So we have this different voice that we can bring to the table. And for me, and maybe it's because I did work in government for such a long time, and especially after hearing today's speaker talking about sort of the supply issue that's happening, not just here in the state, but nationally, I think philanthropy really can help sort of prime the pump and trying to get projects done. What often happens is, here in Connecticut, we're blessed with significant resources from the state when it comes to developing affordable housing. But the reality is that there's limited capacity in organizations and not that many developers out there who can do this work. And sometimes neighborhood development needs to be at a smaller scale, and state and federal dollars just don't work well in those communities. So I think philanthropy can provide those resources, whether it's pre-development funding or technical assistance to even towns and cities, or working with nonprofit developers, CDCs, to provide them the resources to build the affordable housing that's really at the scale that makes sense in their community. So the state has some fairly blunt, very powerful, great tools. I think philanthropy is a bit more nuanced, and it's that type of investment that we're focused on. And again, it complements what the state does, and I think it's bringing both of those tools together can make for some pretty powerful systems change.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I think the enabling environment for housing development and what philanthropy can do to make the water warm or prime the pump is a really important role that I hear I think more funders are coming to the actual development space and thinking about impact investing, right? Like, how do you use potentially your endowment as a form of catalytic capital to maybe spur more development in your community? And we could have a whole other session, frankly, on just that. So I want to move to Kate to switch gears a little bit, because I think the other panelists have shared a little bit about how philanthropy can help push the sector in a lot of ways. But I also think it's important to recognize the ongoing work of many nonprofits that form the core of our housing service sector. And I think especially for a community foundation, where you have a geographic focus and you have sort of a finite pool of nonprofits that you generally work with. Could you talk a little bit about the role that foundations can play in strengthening nonprofits, strengthening the sector, so they can continue this critical work and maybe even work more effectively?
Absolutely. Great question. Thank you, Erica. And good to see everyone on the panel today and some familiar faces and names who have joined us. So nonprofit organizations that have programs of focus on affordable housing preservation and development are often working on tight operating budgets. I'm sure I'm not sharing some wildly new news to folks. They very typically, for example, maybe taking on projects that a for-profit developer just isn't interested in when they're factoring in those upfront development costs, the end value of the project, and that projected revenue on the other side. So when you have nonprofits who have a bottom line being something other than maximizing the dollar, when it's to give residents and a community stable, safe, quality, and affordable housing, they may be taking on projects that have significant upfront costs or are considered to be riskier or too challenging for for-profit developers when for-profit developers are looking and focused on that profit. So this means that in order for us to help stabilize nonprofits and community development organizations that are seeking to increase quality, affordable housing units in our state, we really need to help support them through those projects' life cycles while they're managing those upfront costs and very restricted revenue streams to complete the project until they realize some of that revenue on the other side. Many times for these organizations, their operating budget really relies on that generated revenue from these projects. And keep in mind how long they can take. They're not churning out development projects every quarter. These can take years. So it's a matter of waiting years sometimes to see some revenue or income on the other side. So knowing that, the Hartford Foundation is dedicated to providing what we call core support or operating support over multiple years to community development corporations or CDCs and other nonprofits committed to affordable housing development. And so this flexible operating support is completely unrestricted. In other words, there's no project budget to submit. There's no expenditure report to show how you've dispersed the funds because there's no budget to align that to. And this funding is really meant for organizations to designate where they need that funding to be distributed the most. To us, we see core support as advancing the mission of the entire organization, not just a particular project. And it offers that stability to an org as it rides those waves or the current of the project costs and then the revenue. And so keep in mind these arcs, those waves are very long arcs. And we think it helps to encourage a more robust pipeline of projects where organizations can actually have the opportunity to see or envision beyond their current project and then explore new or different development opportunities. So then in addition to providing that flexible funding, the Hartford Foundation is also invested in providing capacity building and technical assistance support to CDCs and other development organizations through our nonprofit partners. So, for example, the Hartford Foundation supports the Hartford Neighborhood Development Support Collaborative. It's a mouthful, HNDSC, which is managed by LISC Connecticut. That's a funders org that pools our dollars together for flexible core funding to CDCs through a streamlined grant process. And also through that collaborative, and equally as important, LISC Connecticut offers capacity building and technical assistance to participating organizations based on their current needs, their current project flow, whatever they may need. Additionally, that collaborative has been convening all nonprofit developers in Hartford to share best practices, hear from key stakeholders, and help better align advocacy work that some organizations may be engaging in. And truly, the support for CDCs in this capacity has been credited with increasing stability of these nonprofits and making them more competitive in return for federal grants, loans, and other forms of financing that they'll need to secure to complete their projects. And then before I stop, I'll be remiss if I don't highlight that the Hartford Foundation separately also offers an array of technical assistance and capacity building support through our nonprofit support program. We call it NSP for short. NSP offers a range of opportunities and grants to help organizations in the greater Hartford region, not just housing organizations, but any nonprofit in the greater Hartford region plan for their future, whether that's through evaluating programs, evaluating and improving their operational or financial management practices, building strong boards, stronger leadership, all through types of cohorts, workshops, sessions, and also small grant opportunities.
That's great, Kate. It's such a wide array of supports for nonprofit organizations. And I can attest, that I've heard from nonprofits who say, but for the capacity building support, they maybe wouldn't be as competitive for federal or state funding or even, national philanthropic dollars. And so I think that's a really important thing to consider, particularly as a geographic focused funder. How can you support the nonprofits, the core cohort of nonprofits that you work with, to be stronger and more competitive, and hopefully leverage additional resources for your community. So we're now going to move into some questions that I have for the panelists, but encourage those of you who are here, feel free to throw your questions in the chat as well, and hopefully we'll get to some of those. So my first question, I think, will be interesting because we have a wide variety of funders here on the panel, right? So we've got community foundations, which are geographically focused. We've got statewide private foundations. And so your questions may vary, but when somebody comes to you and says, all right, I want to set up a call, I want to talk about a potential project to see if you may be an interested funder, what are the first questions you ask when you get approached with sort of a generic request? And this is a question for all of you, so feel free to jump in.
I'm happy to start, because that's an easy answer for us being geographically focused. The first thing we have to see is if you're aligned. And alignment means a few different things. Are you serving Fairfield County? Can you demonstrate that? Over the years, we've gotten better at supporting organizations that operate statewide, might be, geographically located in other areas, but, being flexible in terms of allowing them the opportunity to make the case for why their program project is important and critical for the betterment of our region. Are you aligned with our mission, vision, and values, right? Is our systems change and racial equity at the core of what you're proposing? There has to be an idea of demonstrable impact on the populations, Black and persons of color, low to moderate income individuals and families, that we can see in our conversations. We can hear them, and on that paper, on that LOI, on that application, we can read them, right? There has to be, I think, a mutual understanding between us and the potential grantee of what we can and can't do, right? There has to be a baseline understanding. So is that organization proposing from Fairfield County Community Foundation that we give them $1 million to build X units of housing? We're very far off if that's the proposal, because that's not how we grant make. That doesn't align with our grant making capacity. We look at things that are maybe more boring to the folks on this call, like your governance, right? Do you have an active board? Are they engaged? Do they reflect the community you serve, right? Same thing with your leadership. Is all your diversity concentrated in lower wage direct service staff? Or do you really have a leadership that looks like the community that you're serving or hope to serve? And then what is your capacity and your plan of action? Do those things align, right? For smaller organizations, sometimes they may have big, audacious goals, when in reality, we need to think about that organization's capacity, staff, resourcing, to make it more realistic for some of the goals they have. And we do that too, and we're happy to meet organizations where they are.
Others? Great, Julie.
I'll jump in, just being a fellow community foundation representative. So much of what Julian shared would be so similar at the Hartford Foundation when we're in that inquiry stage and exploring a funding opportunity. And so much of that is applicable across all sorts of inquiries that come into us and conversations that we engage with, distinct from housing as well. So in addition to what Julian shared, I echo and say yes to all of that from our end. when we're talking about also specific housing development projects, we're going to want to dive into the project itself once we get beyond sort of understanding the organization, their leadership, their vision, their stability, et cetera. And some additional questions we might ask is checking in on the extent to which residents have shaped the vision of the work and how are they involved in the creation and the completion of this said project. If we're looking to, say, support some sort of development work that's purportedly going to benefit a community, well, how does the community say that this will benefit? Is this what they want? Is this the sort of housing development that they're interested in this particular neighborhood? And is there harm associated with this sort of development opportunity? And if that has not been sought out yet, or if there's not something baked into that proposal, we would want to work with that organization to see how we can prioritize that before we move forward in a deeper way as well. Additionally, we're going to want to look into what sort of obstacles stand in their way to get from A to Z. So what is your roadmap? Where do you think you're going to hit snags? And how do you think you can overcome them? And can we support that in any way? If we don't get a sense that we understand what needs to be accomplished, what ducks you need in a row to get from A to Z, that's going to give us some pause as well. And, development projects, nothing new. They're obviously very expensive. And so we're not in a position to make grants to cover those hard construction costs. But we would fund something like pre-development work, something to support, say, feasibility studies, architectural design, legal and consultant fees, and especially that resident engagement component if it hasn't already been done. But we need to feel confident that all these right pieces are there, whether it's, understanding how and what community need this project specifically addressing. Are you passing zoning and any sort of other regulation requirements? Do you have other financing in place, the right financing in place? And how are you going to manage this project moving forward? Those are all sorts of questions that when we're looking at least at housing development or housing developer organizations, those are the kinds of questions we'd be asking.
Yeah,
go ahead.
No, I could jump. Yeah. So I would say I echo many of the things that were said. We are the Connecticut project. We're not, our geography is the whole state. So we're not bound by regions. We're the newest of the organizations here at the table. So I think we're still exploring where our path is in this work. But and with that said, we're open to talk to most folks around what their thoughts are, do some even if it comes down to just sitting and having a conversation and connecting folks and using our other tools besides investment, whether it's align, advocate for certain things, thought partnership, or again, we can bring resources to the table to do that. And our work is rooted in systems change and real world outcomes for people who are lower income and asset limited. And so, if you can prove that work is going to impact those folks in a way that's sustainable, in a way that's really, real systems change, then I think we are aligned. And we don't fund, or we haven't funded actual development projects, although we've worked with partners to do some of that work. So we have funded, pre-development loan pool for rural suburban communities through LISC. We've just published an RFP to select 4 or 5 communities that are interested in joining the Municipal Redevelopment Authority, the MRDA, who are looking to do mixed use and housing around transit hubs. So, we're in that space, but our dollars, we just don't have enough dollars to, to really have meaningful change to build units. So, I'm always up for a good conversation, good thought partnership. I love to chat. So, yeah, it really, really depends. As long as we're mission aligned, I think it's worth having a conversation.
I think both John and I love to chat. Actually, we all love to chat. I think one of the first things, if you don't know about the trust or new to the trust of the conversation, is please look at our website. We're really pretty clear about what we fund or the areas that we fund. I always love having conversations, but it's when it starts at okay, we're thinking about building and shifting power, or we're thinking about narrative change, or we're thinking about policy, then we can start kind of figuring this out together. Some of the best conversations start when we don't really know what, if we could fund, or really what the idea is, and then co-developing it together. I think also one of the things in philanthropy that I continue to learn is that it takes a lot of time to kind of get an idea to money out the door. And a lot of that is, again, thinking together. A project may start out one way and end up in such a different place. Or it might be great in 2024, but we don't have funding, but you can come around back in like 2025 or 2026. So to me, it's all about the relationships and trying to kind of figure out what proposed solution will make the biggest impact on the folks that we're trying to serve.
Those are all great responses. And, I think there's some areas of great alignment among the four of you, and then some areas where you diverge based on your mission and individual organizations. I will say, a lot of people ask me for advice when it comes to approaching funders. And I do think, when you've seen one funder, you've seen one funder, right? Funders really do operate in such unique ways, whether it's based on the type of foundation they are, based on their geographic area, based on their mission, based on their boards, right? And who composes those boards, or their history. So you really do have to do your research. There's no way around that. So we did have one interesting question in the chat that I think we could anticipate given current events. Fran Martin asked, how might the recent election results reinforce and or alter your thinking and approaches to lasting impact? Anyone want to take that one on?
So I'll take it. I'm asked this question, it seems like every other day since the election. So I'm going to first start off by saying I think there's a lot of questions on what's going to happen. I had the pleasure of reading the chapter about housing on 2025, the 2025 project. So it's interesting to see what potentially could be a roadmap for the administration when it comes to affordable housing. Interestingly enough, there's a lot of emphasis on giving support to local government to make decisions. Though, some of that is about regulatory reform, and I think regulatory reform done at the local level is going to be really difficult. But with that being said, if there is a push to do more regulatory reform at on the local level, I think there's an opportunity here for philanthropy maybe to support that. And that whether that's providing resources to folks to help local government go through regs on zoning to see how housing can be built. Things like that might be helpful, supporting an organization or CDFIs to do more local neighborhood developments that's at a scale for a smaller community. And so I think there's opportunity there. There's also opportunity to look at rehabilitating homes in urban centers. There is a bipartisan bill that folks are hopeful will pass with the next year when there's going to be when the tax reform is going to be revisited. That's going to look at building new and rehabbing 1 to 4 family homes. The Neighborhood Homes Act, I think, is what it's called. So looking at that as a potential avenue for folks to, do some real neighborhood reinvestment, especially in urban centers and with land banks. So I think, for us, it doesn't really change how we're investing. But it does, I think we have to be aware of maybe where our government partners may be more absent, and maybe where we can fit, a role in sort of supporting that vacancy. So yeah, I think it's a wait and see approach. But I'm trying to be optimistic that we're still going to see a lot of movement when it comes to building new affordable units.
We do a lot of work in DC with our national partners. And there's a little bit of, we've done this 4 years ago, and are kind of the expectations of it is what it's going to be. I too am trying to think creatively and differently about what that's going to look like. But we can plan and propose all we want now, but I really think the work is starting in January.
And I agree, especially with what Rebecca just shared. There's a sense of anxiety for the nonprofit sector, especially depending on who it is that you focus on, especially if you serve an immigrant population. I see something in the chat about the homeless population. So we're trying to meet our nonprofit partners where they are, right? That's a part of the magic of philanthropy, especially being a community foundation, is we're your neighbor. We're right here in it with you. And we know if you're distracted, we know if you don't have the tools to sit back, take a breath, and maintain that sense of self so you can be resilient through whatever happens over the next 4 years, then there's no way that we can push our mission forward and our mutual mission forward. We also have to think about things that might put us at risk as an institution, because if we go away tomorrow, then we can't invest in some of these transformative solutions that we talked about today. So thinking really critically about how we frame the racial equity component of our work, right? We know that there's gonna, likely be some conversation around that. But it's kind of the intersection of that exploration and that preparedness and staying true and transparent with the folks that we partner with.
Great, thank you. And Becca, I know you were answering in the chat, but maybe you could share a little bit more. We know, the Supreme Court decision on grants passed, and I know Melville's sort of been monitoring this at the national level. So I wonder if you could just speak to that a little bit.
So we have ended up, actually the Housing and Narrative Lab is one of the organizations that we co-created, and they have a lot of great, and we obviously fund them. They have a lot of great information on narrative change regarding housing and homelessness. We also fund the National Alliance to End Homelessness. They have been doing a lot of prep work for grants passed and a lot of now work of like, what do we do? How do we talk about it? And how do we build up local communities? And they are actually, National Alliance to End Homelessness is working with the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness in Connecticut and working with local providers on some strategies.
That's great. And I should also share the Connecticut Council for Philanthropy's housing funders recently had Journey Home as a guest speaker, and we learned a little bit about the pilot program that they've been doing in Hartford, New Britain, and Bristol, really working with municipalities to address encampments in a humane way. So I think, the more that we can offer alternative solutions for municipalities that are trying to, they're trying to thread the needle between, health and safety concerns of residents, and then also, humanely providing the resources that, yes, encampments to housing. Thanks, Becca. So I think we're actually closing in on our last couple minutes here. One quick question I'm going to throw out: if you have like a 20-second response, what do you wish foundations and philanthropy was doing more of in the housing space, or less of?
I believe, this is Larice Harvey from Once Incarcerated Anonymous. I believe nonprofits like mine that are voluntary boards and we have such a small budget, we need more support on infrastructure from our philanthropists when they give us money. And I did not receive a lot of that. And also, if there's something in you want to support our agenda or our project that we're doing, but there's something missing in our grant, instead of just denying it outright, is there opportunities for you to call us because we are small, because we are new, as opposed to giving what we're doing to larger organizations who have bigger budgets and stealing our ideology? Because my ideology has been stolen twice by a department, the commissioner of housing, the barbershop conversations in the community. We're a grassroots nonprofit. They took that. And we're calling our participants and leaders housing ambassadors. Today, I find out they took that too. So how do we keep our narrative because we're people with lived experience,
Mm.
and actually do the work and advocate and get the big dollars if nobody's helping us get those big dollars. Thank you.
Larice, thank you. I mean, right on. I think philanthropy has to do some reckoning with how, frankly, our practices just keep the status quo in place, right? And philanthropy has definitely, the way that we've done funding has contributed to systemic inequity in a lot of ways. So being accessible to grassroots organizations and smaller organizations are on the ground doing the work. There, again, that's another panel that we could have to talk about ways that philanthropy could and should do more. But with that, we are at the end of our time. So I really want to take this moment to thank all of my panelists for joining us today. It was an absolute pleasure to have this conversation with you. I want to thank the Partnership for Strong Communities for hosting us and all the other informative sessions we're going to have later today and tomorrow. And hope everybody enjoys their afternoon. Thank you.